Hi, Afshin. Welcome to Blogging Heads.
Hi, it's nice to be with you, Eric.
Great. So, okay, today we're going to talk all about Iran. And Afshin, you've visited there a number of times. You speak Farsi. You're a perfect guest for today.
Oh, thank you, Eric. It's nice to be with you. As you can see, we have. I'm in my apartment with my kitchen in the background, so I feel like I should be cooking you up some Persian meal or something to go along with the conversation.
We're all about the sophisticated setups, and if you know, all viewers, I believe, are going to get. You have to tell me the name of it. That crispy rice, the burnt rice.
That's right, the tahdig. Oh. The tahdig, right?
Delicious.
It's very delicious.
Right. Okay. So let's move on to the other topics apart from just eating.
Right.
Obviously, the big topic of the past week from Iran was this very nice letter that the president of Iran sent to George Bush. And I get the sort of international component that's been well discussed, right? The sort of the play that he was making in terms of the Security Council, and clearly trying to sort of divide and conquer there, trying to make it harder to pass sanctions and so forth. That's pretty easy. But presumably he was also doing this, presumably for a domestic audience. There was a domestic component to it. So what was the intent, and how do you think it'll play there?
No, I think that's an important point, Eric. And, in fact, just before he left for Indonesia, he's in Indonesia now, he mentioned in a press statement that this letter to President Bush was a letter on behalf of the Iranian people. And he said that this expresses the sentiments of the Iranian people. From my travels across Iran to more than 20 cities and villages, over a 1-year period, and I go back about once a year, I think that's a major stretch for him to say these are the sentiments of the Iranian people. And here's why. I mean, if he did want to write down the sentiments of the Iranian people, I think rather than have 90% of the letter be political and religious, 90% of the letter would be economic. One of the things I was struck by in my travels across Iran is, I was traveling across Iran mostly at a time of heightened political excitement. It was during the reform movement's height.
Let's put those years down. So you were traveling in the late 90s,
late 90s, early 2001, and then right. I've been back every year, since then. And even just my last trip, just about a year ago, even amidst this heightened political excitement, the ordinary concerns of Iranians tend to be more mundane, and they tend to be bread and butter issues. Iran has a very young population. 2/3 are under the age of 30, half are under the age of 21. It needs to create about 1 million jobs a year to keep up with this young population. And so, I would occasionally try to engage young Iranians about sort of a very high philosophical level of discussions, and they would say, "Oh yeah, that's really interesting, but listen, I've applied to university in America, or how can I get a green card, or I don't have a job, and that's my real problem." And Ahmadinejad knows this. In fact, he was very clever during the presidential elections in tapping into the economic indignities of Iranians. When he emerged in the second round and went up against Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, he was very clever in presenting himself as this sort of populist candidate. He presented himself as someone who was untainted by the corruption of the ruling elite. The corruption of the ruling elite is a serious problem which many Iranians do talk about. And his opponent was the embodiment of that corruption of the ruling elite, Hashemi Rafsanjani. And so Ahmadinejad, if you look back at his speeches, when he was really reaching out to the Iranian people because he was trying to get their votes, he spoke about giving them oil checks from the surplus. He spoke about the corruption of the ruling elite, and he spoke about the dignity of the Iranian nation. He didn't speak much at all about uranium enrichment, or about Israel, or about Palestine, or about foreign policy. So when he really was speaking to the Iranian people, he touched those economic issues. And so,
you mentioned...
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. You mentioned in your book, you have a sort of great moment. You say, there's the where's your sauna?
Right. No, you're right.
That?
I mean, I called it the "Where's your sauna" moment in the Iranian presidential election. It was a very important moment when conservative state television, which was basically supporting Ahmadinejad in the second round against Rafsanjani, they went to the home of a former mayor of Tehran who was pretty closely affiliated with Rafsanjani. And they showed his home as being a home that had, exquisite chandeliers, marble floors. There was a sauna, there was a jacuzzi, and it showed that this was a man who enriched himself at the public till. Well,
and then they went to
right after that, they went to the
right.
home of Ahmadinejad, and they showed his home to be very humble, very modest. He drove a worn car, and at one point the interviewer turned to Ahmadinejad's son and said, "Well, where is your sauna?" And that his son said, "Well, what are you talking about? We don't have a sauna." And that one moment, many Iranians were talking about that, particularly among the urban poor and people in rural areas who really feel left out at that moment there was a bit of an economic boom, who really felt left out. They suddenly were saying, well, at least this guy is not corrupt. He's not one of them. He's not a mullah who has enriched himself. So he cleverly managed to portray himself as a protest vote. But it was economics that did it. It wasn't the foreign policy stuff.
So it's a sort of Chavista of Iran in a way, right? I mean, it's economic populism, and there's then a sort of nationalism to it, obviously, right? I mean, nationalism still is a part of it, I assume.
Right. No, I think that's well put, Eric. I mean, in fact, there are a lot of people in Iran talking about how Ahmadinejad, like Hugo Chavez, is injecting themes of class warfare in popular politics in Iran right now. But in some ways, he's taking a page not from the book of Hugo Chavez, but from the book of Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini, it is often forgotten, made many of the similar promises that Ahmadinejad made. Ayatollah Khomeini, when he was speaking out against the Shah as a revolutionary, one of the charges that he often made was the Shah and his petro elite are corrupt and they are stealing the nation's resources. And Ayatollah Khomeini actually said in one of his famous speeches that he will deliver checks to the oppressed and the barefoot. One of the aspects of Ayatollah Khomeini that is often forgotten is his economic populism. And Ahmadinejad took a page from that playbook.
Well, that leads to the second part of it, right? If part of his draw, and let's be clear on this, is that plenty of candidates were ruled out, right? So and plenty of people didn't vote. Right. So it's not like he actually got a majority of the electorate to support him. But insofar as economic populism was a big part of it, then the question becomes, well, it's now been a year or nearly a year since he was elected, and what good has he done for them lately? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I'm interested has he been able to deliver at all? And if he's not able to deliver much, what does that mean in terms of support for the government?
Right. No, I think, your first point, very important. 20 million Iranians did not actually vote in the second round of the elections. The Guardians Council, which is this body that has the ability to vet all candidates for elective office, vetted many candidates who could have been serious contenders. And so, but amidst this flawed election, Ahmadinejad played the populist card. Now we go to, your second part of your question, which is, has he delivered? Well, by all indications, the high oil price has masked some of the economic failure in Iran. And so Ahmadinejad and his camp, they have a lot of money to play with. And that money is being used to continue to provide this elaborate system of subsidies and to deliver patronage to its constituents. Iran has about $20 billion a year in subsidies on everything from oil, gas, electricity and water, and a population of 70 million people. Indonesia, by contrast, 3 times the size of Iran, it has about $5 billion a year in subsidies. So they are able to deliver more than they would have if the oil price were low. But industrial investment is down. foreign private sector investment is down. There's massive capital flight, from Iran. I was just in Dubai.
It's not exactly a long-term plan that they have, in other words, right?
No,
it's a short
that's
infusion.
right. And just one last point, I was in Dubai about a week ago, and all the real estate agents in Dubai were telling me that some of their biggest buyers of one-bedroom apartments and studio apartments are Iranians. Well, that tells me that many middle-class Iranians are using their money to buy property abroad rather than using their money to buy property in Iran.
That's actually, you mentioned in your book at one point, the brain drain. You followed, right, some young Iranian computer programmers, I believe, who headed to Syria in order to get visas to then go to Canada, right? And there's just no opportunity for them to survive as computer programmers in Iran. And which raises the point to me. I mean, it made me think about a lot of times you hear from more sort of conservative points of view. Or actually not just conservative points of view, that, look, the government is not going to be able to sustain itself, particularly because you have so many young people. They're so disillusioned with the government, right? And they're typically pro-American, and they're going to be the ones who are going to come up and eventually sort of change the government. But if you have the people who are more educated, who are sort of well-educated, the middle and upper class, who are leaving, right? You have a lot less. It's a pressure valve, right?
Right.
I mean, it's in a way it's a pressure valve, so it releases some of the issues for them, and which makes change less likely, I would think.
No, I think you're right, and it is one of the saddest things to see if you care about Iran and Iranians, as I do, to see these young people, the best and the brightest young Iranians, lined up outside these foreign embassies and sometimes treated like chattel. And in my book, I chronicled the journey of one young man. He was in his early 30s, as he went to Damascus, Syria, to stand outside the Canadian embassy to seek a work visa to Canada. And in many ways, this had become a rite of passage for many educated middle-class Iranians who, frustrated by the lack of job opportunities at home, they would fly to Damascus, Syria, where the Canadian embassy there would take work visa applications. The Canadian embassy in Tehran refused to take them anymore because they were so overwhelmed. And one of the interesting...
So they can't even go out from Canada anymore.
That's right, yeah. And one of the interesting things is, Syria is also the home to a few prominent Shia religious shrines. So in the front of this Iran Air plane, you had some elderly religious pilgrims who were going to these Shia religious shrines in Damascus, and in the back of the plane, you had these economic pilgrims who were going to the Canadian embassy, which was, in a sense, their shrine and their pilgrimage. And it was very sad to see, and the numbers are hard to come by. But the education minister of Iran was once quoted as saying there was anywhere from 150,000 to 200,000 Iranians who leave each year. I mean, I know the statistics are notoriously hard to come by in Iran, but I can just tell you anecdotally, I began traveling to Iran as a journalist in 1998, and I have 5 members of my family, young, who since then have left, and these are very well-educated young Iranians who really would prefer to stay in their country and to serve their people and to live next to their family, but the lack of opportunity required them to leave.
Right. In terms of, you were just mentioning the sort of numbers hard to come by, and it reminded me, are there any polls, I mean, in terms of public sentiment in Iran, to get a sense of support for the government? I don't know if they've been, obviously that's a touchy issue. And you mentioned in your book, I think at one point, that a pollster was jailed for doing a controversial poll, right? But is there any sort of sense of sentiment, that's apart from sort of obvious anecdotal or common sense, but actually sort of hard numbers out there?
Well, there was a government poll that was conducted a couple of years ago, and the number and the question was, are you satisfied with government? And it was something like 80 to 85% said no. But that could be anything from they're not satisfied with the economic management, they're not satisfied with the lack of political freedoms. It could have been anything. So I think in the absence of good polling, because really there isn't good polling, because there was a period in which there was pretty good polling in the late 90s and early part of the 21st century, and these pollsters went and asked one particular question, which got them into trouble, was, would you like your government to restore relations with the United States and restore dialogue with the United States? And to both of those questions, the answers were 65% to restore relations, 75% to restore dialogue. And those pollsters were, thrown in jail. But people like me who go in and out of Iran, journalists who are based in Iran, Dan DeLuce, who was a correspondent for The Guardian, an American journalist, he said that what struck him the most when he went to Iran for the first time was the dramatic difference between the reality on the ground and the image that is often projected of Iran, you really sense that. Like take for example, you had mentioned Iranians being sort of pro-American, and that's largely true from the sense that I got. I mean, shortly after 9/11, Iranians were the only ones who went out and had a spontaneous candlelight vigil to commemorate the victims of 9/11. And I travel a lot in the region, Eric, and I've been in Saudi Arabia recently, Egypt, Jordan, and these are strong allies of the United States. The level of anti-American sentiment on the street among the populace is extraordinary, and you just don't see that in Iran.
Well, it's actually logical in an odd way, right? If the government of those places are in many ways, in Saudi Arabia, for example, oppressing citizens in a sense, the same thing in Iran, you would expect that it would sort of be, then the population would be more supportive of whoever is criticizing the government.
Right. No, I mean, you got it exactly right. It's the sort of inverse proportionality.
Right.
The closer your government is to the United States, the more the population is going to resent the United States, especially if that government is an authoritarian one. And the more antagonistic the government is to the United States in an authoritarian environment, the more the population is going to, either be pro-American or to paraphrase a friend, Karim Sajidpour of the International Crisis Group, who said that Iranians are probably the least anti-American population in the region.
You were also, I assume you were getting at, in terms of the sort of complexity of sentiment in Iran. I assume one of the things that you were also getting at was the strong sense of nationalism.
Right.
And actually, Juan Cole on his site just flagged, and you're going to have to remind me of her name, but the human rights lawyer from Iran who won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Shirin Ebadi.
Right. Well, yeah. She just gave a speech a few days ago in which, among other things, she basically warned the U.S. against military action.
Right.
And said, not just from a strategic sense, but said that will really piss us off, as Iranians.
Right. Yeah. And the nationalism remains very powerful in Iran, and it's something that I noticed. Just about everywhere when I traveled across Iran. It didn't matter whether I was in a small city or a major metropolis like Tehran. There is this real sort of pride in being Iranian. In fact, going back to your question of polls, there was one poll. I think it was a Pew Global Survey poll, but it was published in Foreign Policy about a year and a half ago. And the question was, how proud are you to be X? Chinese, American, German, French, Italian. And they asked people in those respective countries. Well, Iran and Iranians came at the very top of that poll. How proud are you to be Iranian? Something like 91 or 92%. So there is this, Shirin Ebadi was talking about it in the context of an American strike, on Iran.
Right.
I will talk about it, in a different context. There is this sense that this is an old civilization. Many Iranians believe that they have contributed significantly to the advance of civilization, and in many ways they have. If you look back through Iranian history, it has produced some of the world's most gifted poets and scientists and thinkers and architects, and it has fertilized Islamic civilization. And Iran in the modern 20th century, its nationalism was often wrapped up in a sense that the country must move forward in terms of building a constitution, creating more freedom for its people. And so I think that part of it is also an important part of Iran's nationalism. Iran's first attempt at constitutional government and curbs on the arbitrary power of kings came more than 100 years ago, and it was wrapped in a nationalist movement. So that's another aspect of nationalism that's worth noting.
There was actually, which actually briefly reminds me of the letter from this week, because there was also something pointed out by Juan Cole, and I don't know that if Ahmadinejad was purposely trying to evoke this or not. I don't know how many people would remember it, but Juan Cole pointed out that in the early 1950s, when there was tension rising between the U.S. And Iran, and Iran's properly elected president, Mossadegh sent a letter to Eisenhower, basically proposing negotiations and so forth, and was completely rebuffed. And as we both know, and many other people know, the U.S. and the CIA then very quickly supported a coup against him. And this is, it's something, I don't know how sort of deep the knowledge is in the U.S. about it, but it's obviously, I assume to some degree it is still a sort of touchy subject in Iran.
Sure.
As a sort of sense in terms of nationalism and so forth.
No, absolutely. And the interesting thing about that moment of nationalism was that there was a sense of it was a nationalism that was often directed against foreigners, because in so many ways foreigners, particularly the British and the Russians in the early part of the 20th century, had a nefarious history of meddling in Iranian affairs.
Screwing Iran out of its oil revenues and
That's right. And then after 1953 and the CIA-supported coup d'etat, Americans suddenly became the foreigner meddling in Iranian affairs. But the interesting thing about nationalism in Iran today is there's less of a foreign target against in today's Iranian nationalism. And in many ways, the target of Iranian nationalism is often the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran itself. I was quite intrigued, and I would be attending pro-democracy protests in Iran, and often people would begin singing the pre-revolution national anthem of Iran that was suffused with sort of nationalist themes, and it was a way to differentiate themselves from the post-revolution national anthem. It was a way to say that we are nationalists, we believe in our country, but we also believe in democracy. So I think Shirin Ebadi is broadly right in the sense that an attack could spur new levels of nationalism directed against a foreign enemy.
Right.
But it is worth noting that today's nationalism is less wrapped in that xenophobic direction against a foreign meddler, and more wrapped in ideas of democracy and freedom and basic dignity, economic dignity of the Iranian people.
But it's obviously in the government's interest to keep that nationalism writ large ramped up by having some sense of a sort of foreign crisis or a foreign enemy, right? It's why it seems to me that for them, at least keeping the sort of nuclear crisis, at least keeping it to a slow boil is, I would think, very tempting for them. It's in their interest, right? It creates, we're all in this together. The U.S. is trying to screw us out of civilian, out of our getting our energy needs met and so forth. It's a way to, as in many countries, is a way to kind of bind together against a foreign enemy.
Right. No, there's certainly an element of that, and it also, the other thing it does is when you have this crisis, continuing on a slow boil, it contributes to the high oil price, which allows the government to have enormous cash reserves to distribute to the security services and to the volunteer militia known as the Basij, and to offer in the form of subsidies. But this on the nuclear issue itself, again, this is an issue that sometimes is somewhat lazily depicted by the Western media as something that Iranians are sort of lockstep in favor of. The nuclear program of Iran, whether it's enrichment or a weapon. I find that the debate, on Iranian blogs, in the Iranian media, among Iranians when you're talking to them, is actually, there isn't really a monolithic view, on this. I mean, there are clearly many who will offer that argument that, when we look around the region, Israel has nuclear weapons, Russia, Pakistan, India, they all have nuclear weapons. Why can't we? Some will say, well, why can't we have nuclear technology? The West is trying to prevent us. But you will also hear others say, well, I don't mind nuclear weapons in the hands of a different regime, or we worry that there has been, this regime has shown incompetence in managing the system in the past, and we worry about Chernobyl-type accidents. So the debate in Iran is actually more diverse than is sometimes depicted. One of the great things about, the best thing about learning what Iranians think is actually being in Iran. But in the absence of that, there's, these wonderful blogs. And let me just plug a book, if you don't mind.
Okay.
There's a wonderful book by Nasreen Alavi called We Are Iran. I'll show it to you right there. And it is a wonderful account of the Persian blogs. And Persian is the fourth most commonly used language in the blogosphere. And on a daily basis, you're reading a whole range of opinions on. And one of the interesting things about Persian blogs is it's sort of like, as I said in the beginning of the conversation, the vast majority of them are not political. They sort of talk about their personal life. They post pictures. But this particular book translates for an English language reader some of the political content of the Persian blogs, and you'll see the debate is very vibrant.
Okay, well, I mean, who wouldn't think there wouldn't be vibrant debate in the blogosphere and elsewhere?
Right.
I could see it. Fair enough. I could see it as depicted otherwise often in the U.S. press.
Right.
In terms of the in terms of the nuclear crisis, let's just focus on that issue for a moment. Couldn't you see? Let's assume there aren't going to be military strikes. Call me crazy. I suspect they're not going to happen. Certainly not going to happen anytime soon. And let's assume that the sort of what might happen, apart from any grand bargain, is sanctions. It strikes me, insofar as we were just talking about the Iranian government potentially it being in their interest to kind of foment a little bit of a crisis, basically, with the U.S. and the Great Satan. They risk the potential of getting sanctions. And it strikes me that sanctions could break both ways. I mean, it could relieve some of the pressure and say, look, all these economic problems, it's not our fault. It's the U.S. cracking down on us. Or it could break the other way, and this obviously isn't an all or one thing, but it could break the other way, and people could blame the government and say, why can't you cooperate with the U.S. or the UN or whoever it might be? Why do we have to suffer more now? In other words, there's the question of sort of who's going to get blamed.
Right.
I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
I think you raise a good point, and I think just in general, sanctions are not a very good idea. These sanctions that in any way affect the Iranian populace, because if we are, as President Bush has said many times, trying to reach out to the hearts and minds of the Iranian people, one of the worst ways to do it is to sanction them, because they're already facing enough economic troubles. And one of the things that I found when I was traveling across Iran is this desire to simply be, a normal country again, to have normal trading relationships, to this was something that would come up over and over again. And this is not just in Iran. There was a very interesting story. An Iraqi scholar was telling me that when he was in Iraq during the time of the writing of the Constitution, he and some colleagues were poring over the details of the Constitution, and they were really excited. And he walked outside and he saw that there were these young Iraqis who were poring over this document, and he thought this was great. They're looking at the Constitution, they're debating it, but in actual fact, they were looking at the latest Iraq-NA cell phone program, and they were debating which cell phone option to choose. And I often find that that's the case, in Iran and across the region. And one way to reach out to the hearts and minds is to, economically engage. And this is, something that Bob Wright, who's the head of Blogging Heads TV, argues. And I tend to agree with him that when you engage economically with the people, you are helping them create alternative independent power centers to the ruling elites, the ruling authoritarian elites. And it seems to me that our policy ought to be, rather than threatening, sanctions that would hurt the people, ought to be actual economic engagement that would bolster these middle classes that tend to be pro-American, that tend to want some of the same things that many Americans want, and that tend to be far more pro-democracy as well. So, in general, I just think sanctions is a bad idea, and whether it will break to the favor of Washington or not, I think it will actually break against Washington if sanctions hurt the Iranian people.
So you think that throw out the sticks? Are you? I mean, maybe this is. I will admit to being reductive at this point, but I'm not allowed to do it on blogging.
Well, I mean, there are other sticks that one could use, but it seems to me that right now we haven't even tried, any diplomacy. And again, look, I've lived in Iran. I've experienced Iran. I'm fully aware of how repressive this regime is. I'm fully aware of. I have a good friend, Ramin Jahanbegloo, who is one of the most wonderful scholars, a real practitioner of dialogue and tolerance, who is in prison right now. So I'm fully aware of what this regime, is capable of. But I still believe that, to paraphrase the Donald Rumsfeld line, sometimes you have to deal with the Iran that you've got, not the Iran that you wish you had. And in the lack of high-level dialogue, between the two principal antagonists, the United States and Iran, I think is a dereliction of diplomatic responsibility. I mean, these are issues of war and peace we're talking about. And the fact that these two sides are not sitting down and talking to each other, even if it's in a multilateral setting, we don't know what the shape of an agreement will actually look like. But what I do know is that we're not going to get one unless there is some level of engagement between the two principal antagonists. And so, sometimes when people ask me what policy ought to be, I think it's very difficult to say what U.S. policy ought to be in the absence of some level of strategic dialogue between the two sides. I mean, even on the
in other words, simply a willingness to talk. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
basically, if we, President Bush recently said that, diplomacy is our option. Well, part of diplomacy is actually, engaging. Now, this is not to say always that when Washington has been ready to engage, Iran has been ready to engage. And so we've had this dance, for 26, 27 years, but there have been instances in recent history in which U.S. diplomats have engaged with Iranian diplomats, most notably in the run-up to the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, in which U.S. officials have said that Iran has played a constructive role. Now, again,
that was, of course, before the U.S. or President Bush labeled Iran a part of the axis of evil.
That's right. I mean, there are some Iranian officials who say, well, we played a constructive role in the Bonn negotiations in Germany in the run-up to the Afghan war, and then we were labeled an axis of evil country as a result. Now, look, I mean, I'm the first one to point out that, the Islamic Republic of Iran, if they're a danger to anyone, they're a danger to their people, first and foremost. They haven't delivered to their people economically. They repress other people. There are students who are being jailed as we speak. But at the end of the day, we're talking about U.S. national security. We're talking about global stability. We're talking about the possibility of war here. And the mere fact that Washington and Tehran are not able to, in some capacity, sit across the table, whether it's in a multilateral fashion, whether it's in a more secretive talks, in a foreign capital, which was the sort of the format of the talks that took place between Zalmay Khalilzad at the time and Iranian ambassador to the United Nations Javad Zarif. Some level of diplomatic engagement, I think, is necessary. And we should. Sorry, go on.
No, I'm sorry. We should just clarify here what we're talking about. I want to make sure we're on the same page, because my understanding of the history, and it's not that widely known. You don't see it on the front page of the New York Times or whatever that much. But it appears to be that Iran, over the past few years, particularly in around 2003, I believe, made some overtures through the Swiss government in terms of negotiations. And forgetting about this letter, which doesn't seem to me to be a real effort at negotiation, but in the past did make some efforts at negotiation. And it was, and I don't mean to put it all on the U.S. side, but it looks like it was all on the U.S. side, rebuffed. The U.S. just said, we're not interested in talking.
Right.
Is that the same understanding you have?
Yeah, that is my understanding. In 2003, there was a significant letter that was transferred by the Swiss embassy to the National Security Council. And in that letter, from what I understand, contained an elements of a grand bargain. And in that letter, Iran put everything on the table and said we're willing to discuss everything from peace process issues to the nuclear issues to regional security. And you're right, that letter was rebuffed. And again, this is not to say, there are people in this town who, when you use the word dialogue, they say, aha, appeasement. Dialogue does not mean appeasement. It can be cold and sober dialogue. It can be argumentation. But at the end of the day, as I said, we're talking about war and peace here. So it seems to me that we ought to be able to find a mechanism in which the two sides, the two principal antagonists, can lay out their bottom lines, and then truly, if it does come to war, and I certainly would not want to see that. I just think it would be a disaster for U.S. national interest and a disaster for the Iranian people. If it does come to that, both sides can say they did exhaust diplomatic options, but there's an absence of diplomacy right now, and we in the United States have outsourced the diplomacy to the European Union.
We should say, actually, I don't know if you saw this report in the front page of the Washington Times this morning, and I believe Washington Post, sorry, and I believe it's elsewhere as well, that the U.S., and it was all very sort of sketchy, the details, but that the U.S. was now willing to put its weight behind, or at least sign on to, a European effort to indeed offer more carrots in terms of economic aid and stuff. Did you see that?
I did see that, and from the sense I get is that Washington sort of reluctantly accepted that, but they really, there's so much mistrust between these two sides that Washington has very little expectation that Iran is going to actually even abide by an agreement if they sign an agreement.
But you don't think that was a real... Basically, you don't buy that was a particularly sort of heartfelt offer by the U.S., or that it represents any significant change. I mean, it doesn't strike me as nothing.
Well, it's sort of similar to what Washington did last time with the European Union when the European Union offered a deal to Iran, which wasn't a very substantive deal, from the Iranian side, and Washington basically endorsed that deal, but as I said, it wasn't a very substantive deal. So if they come up with a more substantive deal this time, and Washington endorses it, and it becomes part of a new strategic dialogue, which involves Washington, because I talk to European diplomats, and I talk to Iranian officials, and I talk to American officials. And when I talk to European diplomats and Iranian officials, they often tell me that the elephant in the room is this sort of lack of a U.S. presence, in the dialogue. Now, again, I mean, this is not to say that Iran would sanction some sort of high-level dialogue, and so it's a thorny problem, because there have been times when Washington has been ready, like in the late years of the Clinton administration, and Iran wasn't ready. In 2003, Iran was ready to initiate a strategic dialogue, and Washington wasn't ready. And now, I just think it's time for both nations to step forward and say we're ready.
presumably one of the things that the U.S. can offer that Europe can't really offer is a meaningful promise to say, we're not going to bomb you. We're not going to try to, or we're not going to try to overthrow the country. I mean, Germany can say that. It doesn't mean a whole lot.
Right.
If the U.S. says it, those are significant security guarantees. Presumably, that's one of the major sticking points on.
It is one of the major sticking points. But when you talk to Iranian officials, they really draw the red line at uranium enrichment, and they.
You mean we want to be able to?
They want to be able to achieve the full nuclear fuel cycle, which experts, people who know a lot more about this than I do, will tell me that you can enrich at a low grade and with fairly aggressive IAEA inspections, maintain low grade enrichment for nuclear fuel.
Right. In other words, there's still space for a deal.
I think there is still space for a deal. And again, let's not assume that Iran is seeking nuclear weapons, but let's not assume that they are not seeking nuclear weapons either. And even if we bring both of those into play, by most U.S. intelligence estimates, Iran is 5 to 10 years away from a nuclear weapon if they were seeking one and if they went full tilt to acquire one. Well, that does give us a little bit of time to talk, and so I just think that it sounds. I should come up with sort of 5 or 6 policy measures. This is what the United States ought to offer. This is what Iran ought to do.
No, it's just blogging it. You don't have to do that. Don't worry.
Exactly. No. But what I'm saying is that we won't know the shape of a deal until the principal antagonists actually sit down and talk about the shape of a deal.
Right. Now, that's a good segue to, in terms of who would be the key players on a deal on the Iranian side. I don't want to get out of here without sort of acknowledging that, we all talk about President Ahmadinejad and, when he makes these comments about whether potentially to wipe Israel off the map, although apparently that's in some question. You can go to Bob's earlier discussion with Mickey about that, where he went on and on about that point. But in any case, the one of the obvious questions is, that's not that much discussed in the U.S. is how much power he really has. Mm-hmm. And obviously, you see these reports, that it's really this sort of clerics who are in real control. And there was this instance, I think it was in the last week, that really kind of brought that up again. And it was where, and it showed a sort of more complex picture than I typically sort of understand or get a sense of. And it was where the president had allowed U.S. Not U.S. had allowed for women to attend soccer games in Iran, and then he was basically overturned, right? Which showed him to be slightly more less hardline than I thought, and then of course showed him not to be the man of so much power that we all assume.
Right. I mean, that was an interesting instance in which he allowed for. He said that women should be allowed to attend soccer games, and the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who still has virtual veto power over all matters of state, repudiated him essentially. But I mean, broadly speaking, that was basically one measure that he's actually one liberalization measure that he's made. But broadly speaking, he and his principal deputies have rolled back any of the liberal reforms that were initiated in the previous government. We're finding we're finding more students being either kicked out of university for political activity or jailed. And there was also talk of a cracking down on dress code violations and that sort of thing. But the question of how much power that Ahmadinejad has, I think, is a significant one. And traditionally the presidency in the past sort of 2 presidencies or so has never been a very powerful position within the structure of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The real powers that matter in the structure of the Islamic Republic of Iran are the Supreme Leader's office, which is occupied now by Ayatollah Khamenei. But some of these other offices, which don't get a lot of attention, like the Assembly of Experts, which is a group of more than 80 clerics who essentially select the Supreme Leader. The Guardians Council, which is a group of 6 clerics and 6 lay jurists who have veto power over candidates for elective office. And then there's, there's the judiciary, which has a significant amount of power. And so you have these diffuse power centers in Iran, and Ahmadinejad is one individual who is seeking power. But as your example pointed out, he cannot do whatever he wants. And there is a generational difference between Ahmadinejad's camp, who come from the second generation of revolutionaries who cut their teeth not in the fight against the Shah, but in the fight against Iraq, in the Iran-Iraq War. Comes from military backgrounds, and they are they are different than the generation of revolutionaries who cut their teeth in the fight against the Shah. But Eric, can I just weigh in on the issue of wiping Israel off the map and what Ahmadinejad said?
Weigh in, please.
I know that there might have been the translation of the statement might not have been literally what Ahmadinejad said, but I still think that one mustn't parse words on these things, because at the end of the day, what he said was pretty reprehensible, and the level of anti-Semitic and comments that come from both him and from senior members of the Iranian clergy are not really forgivable, and they're not forgivable on a moral level, but on a strategic level, they serve very little Iran's national interest as well. And so whether he said they should be wiped off the map, or that the state of Israel should not exist, or however you want to translate it, I just found it to be not really the sort of thing that many Iranians believe, B, somewhat morally reprehensible, and C, not in Iran's real strategic interest. Iran is about as strategically isolated as you can be, and in this moment when they actually need allies, that's the sort of thing that makes life even more difficult for the pragmatic figures in Iran when they're seeking to negotiate with their Western interlocutors.
Right. Well, I certainly agree with you on B, in terms of morally reprehensible, regardless of the exact translation.
Right.
And I will defer to you in terms of A and C, in terms of the wisdom of it.
Right.
And, well, listen, I think our time is just about drawing to an end here.
Right.
And thank you very much for coming on Blogging.
It was a pleasure, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Another fine segment. Thanks. All right, take care. Afshin, wait, hold on one second. I don't want to leave here without showing our viewers the fine book that you've written, which is now out in paperback, The Soul of Iran. I'm going to put it up here.
Thank you very much.
It's a wonderful read. It's a great travelogue, very thoughtful. And until next time.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.